So let's go ahead and get started then. I've already installed Jinja and Flask, so I should just be able to use them. And the first thing I'm going to do is in my course instructors project from lab 3, I'm going to go ahead and make a directory called static. And that's going to be for static content. And then I'm also going to make a new directory called templates. And that's going to be for Jinja templates. And then for testing purposes in my static folder, I'm going to create a new HTML file. And it's going to select HTML5 by default and use a template. And so I'm going to call this hello. And so the actual file name will be hello.html. And it's stubbed in sort of a template for document. So the title will be hello from Flask, exclamation point. And then in the content of the body, I'm going to have an H1 header, which is the biggest possible header. Welcome to Flask. And then I'll put a paragraph after the header that says Flask is a framework for building web servers in Python. I guess I'll capitalize it. It is not a web server per se, but it does include a simple web component for running your server. And I'll tell you more about what that means in a minute. So there's an HTML page that I'm serving out of my static folder. And then, and I'll come back to the Jinja in a minute. So I'm going to right click on course instructors, create a new Python file. And according to the lab instructions, I said to call that, whatever your password manager was, call it password manager web. I have course instructors UI, maybe course instructors web UI. Not super picky about that. And then I told you, I think somewhere in here, I told you that I wanted you to put a single class. Yeah, so password manager should have a class definition for your Flask web server. So we're going to use object-oriented programming, which goes a little bit beyond what you're going to see in most of the tutorials, but it's actually not going to be too hard to get that to work. And so that's what we're going to start with. So I'm going to start by importing Flask. So from Flask, I'm going to import the Flask class, and I'll be importing more stuff over time, but that's a starting point. And then inside of here, I'm going to have a single class called course instructors web UI. And then I'm going to have a constructor, which for now is just going to pass. And then inside of here, I'm going to have a class property because I only want to have one of them, but I'm going to have one app object. So my app object is going to be an instance of Flask, which is the web framework. And I'm going to associate that one app with the course instructor's web UI class. So we'll say under app is equal to, and I'm going to make a new Flask object. And when I do that, you can see some of the options I can include. I can give it a name. I can give it a static URL path. The main important ones are actually later on, I'm going to go ahead and call a run method on this app. So let me come back to that. So now I have an app object. And then one thing I am going to do in the constructor is if you want to include sessions in your app, then you need to set a secret key. So Flask uses encryption in order to protect any of your session data, so that when you create a session to the Flask web server, your browser basically exchanges a cookie with the web server when it connects up the first time. And then it sends back that cookie on subsequent page fetches. And so using that cookie, the web server can identify the browser that's connecting to it, and it can maintain a session, which is basically just a dictionary with whatever properties you want to set on it, that gets flushed out to a temporary file somewhere. And you can dig around and actually find where they're being stored, but I'm not going to worry about that just yet. So basically, your session is a dictionary, and you can put whatever values you want as properties of that session dictionary, or you can access properties that were set on previous page views. And that allows you to maintain state from one page view to another page view. And that's all tied to a cookie that your browser shares with the web server. And all of that information in the session dictionary gets encrypted using a secret key. So you need to set that secret key, and typically in a real production web server, you would set the secret key to be a randomly generated sequence of bytes, so that every time you started up the web server, it would get a new random secret key. It basically render all the previous sessions invalid, forcing anybody to reconnect to the web server if you're restarting the web server. But that's actually not a big deal usually, because we've all had to re-log into websites when they've gone down or we lost our connection to them. So it's just something that people are used to when they're on the web. So all I need to do in order to set the secret key is say course instructors web UI dot under app dot secret key is equal to, and then some string value. And then, like I said, in a real server, there's a function that I can call that will generate a random sequence of bytes that I can use for my secret key. But for testing purposes, this is going to make my life a little easier, because it means I'm using the same key value across multiple restarts of the web server. And so I don't have to re-establish a session each time. And then I misspelled that, so it should be web UI. All right, so not much so far, but now we're going to start getting interesting, because I'm going to have a run method. And what it's going to do is it's going to call course instructors web UI dot under app dot run. And then here I can specify some parameters. So the important ones are the host name or IP address of machines that are allowed to connect to the web server. And the default value for that is basically anybody can connect. And then port, which I told you to use port 80 for your web server. So the default port is port 5000. If we want to specify a different port to run on and listen for connections, that's where you do it. And I am going to specify that. So we'll say port equals 8000. And then that's all I really need for this. So what this is going to do is it's going to start up a web server, and it's going to start listening on port 80 of this machine for connections. And then when somebody does connect, it's going to look for a hypertext transfer protocol request, and it's going to respond to it. So there's my stub class, simplest possible Flask class. And then in my main, if under name is equal to under main, and I think I might need to actually specify an app name in this constructor here. So let me come back to that. If under name is equal to under main, app is equal to my course instructor's web UI. So we'll make one of those. And then I'm going to call the run method on my app. And that should launch my web server. So let's go ahead and try it. I'm going to right click on course instructor's web UI and run. And I do need to actually give it a name like so. So let's try it again. Okay, so it started up. I got some warning messages. This warning here, it says this is a development server. Do not use it in a production deployment. Use a production WSGI server instead. And that's web server gateway interface. So basically, like I was saying, Flask is a framework for developing websites and web servers. And it comes bundled with a simple web server that you can use for development that runs your framework as a web server. But if you want to do this on a production level, you actually want to run a web server that's tuned and fast and efficient. And there are several that you can get that are compatible with the websites that you build using the Flask framework. So that was a long-winded way of saying, I'm going to ignore this warning. And I understand this is a development server and not a production server. But if you do want to run a production server after you've gotten this working, you can just install a WSGI production server and run that instead of running Flask. And that's basically a one-line change. Okay, so my web server is running. Let's see if it actually works. I'm going to go to my browser and let's go to localhost :8000. And I get not found when I try to access the root page of my web server because I haven't defined any paths or anything. But what I can do is I can specify the static folder and hello world.html, just hello.html. And I get my static web page that says, welcome to Flask. Flask is a framework for building web servers in Python and so on. So my server is up and running and I can serve any static content that I put in the static folder. If I want to put an image, well, I'm going to go to Google and I'm going to search for cute puppy. And I'm going to pick this. He's so cute. He's in a teacup. And I'm going to right click on that and save image as, and then I'm going to navigate to where I put my project, which I think is in PyCharm projects. See users, Mark G, PyCharm projects. And then course instructors, static. And I'm going to change the name to just puppy.jpg. And then if I go back to the browser and change the URL to puppy.jpg, let's try JPG. There it is. So works fine for serving not only HTML, but also images, audio, whatever. Flask basically figures out the MIME type associated with each of the files it's serving and sets an appropriate MIME type on the response that it sends to the browser, if you remember that from last time.